Good afternoon, everybody. It's me, Stuart Barrow, occupational therapist and managing director of Promoting Independence. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for practical assessments for home adaptations. This is part 3, and this is on access, and we will be joined today from Claire Miller, independent occupational therapist and trainer for the Disabled Living Foundation. A couple of housekeeping things, because I know quite often we get asked. Certificates will be emailed to you. If you have an individual link, certificates will be emailed to you straight away. If you've requested a direct link, please contact us and we'll get your certificate sent out to you within the next 7 to 10 days. The session is recorded and we will have links for the recordings, and again, these will be sent out to you within the next couple of weeks. If you have any problems hearing me or anybody else, please log off and log back in. Hopefully that will resolve the issue. But like I said, the session is recorded. So if you're having problems, just drop us an email and we'll sort that out for you. So the way it will go is I will do the introduction like I am now. I will hand you over to Claire from Disabled Living Foundation to do a brief introduction about Disabled Living Foundation for those of you who aren't aware. And Claire will hand you across to Claire Miller, who will run the presentation. At the end, you'll be passed straight back to me so I can collate all the questions that you sent throughout the session. So if you please use the chat box, pop any questions in, say hello to each other. Anything you're stuck on or anything you think you want some clarity on, please pop it in the chat box. My team will play it up and pass it to me, and then I will have a quick peek and I'll ask Claire Miller and Claire from DLF at the end, and then we'll finalise the presentation, probably keeping to around 55-60 minutes. So thank you very much, and without further ado, I'd like to hand you across to Claire from Disabled Living Foundation.
Thank you, Stuart, and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm just going to run through very quickly DLF, the charity, just to give you a bit of a brief idea of who we are and what we do. I'm pretty sure some of you have already joined us for some of the webinars so far, so I am going to try and keep it as short and sweet as possible. But we are a charity that's been around about 50 years, and our aim is to give impartial information and advice to as many people as possible about aids, adaptations, and technology. We reach over 2 million people annually, and we do that through a number of services, one being Living Made Easy, which I'm sure some of you have used in the past. It's an online marketplace with over 10,000 products from over 950 retailers, and it assists a person to choose products and find where they can purchase them. We also have Ask Sarah, which is our assessment tool, which enables somebody to find some advice around equipment when they're not sure what it is that they need. It's written by occupational therapists and reviewed regularly, and we do have a range of custom versions that we've created for local authorities and charities, as you can see here on the screen. We also offer services for professionals, and at the moment we are in the process of creating our new prescribing tool. So for those of you who are mature enough to remember, we used to have the Hamilton Index quite some time ago with the big ring binders on the shelves of OTs in the country. That changed into DLF data, and in March 2021, so next month, we'll be launching Pro Assist, which will be a fantastic new tool to help with the selection of solutions of equipment. It will also contain lots of evidence base and information there to help you with decisions. And we are looking for people at the moment, where possible, to help us feedback on or comment on the tool. If you're interested in getting involved with that project, please do give us a shout. Our email will come up at the end. I'm also happy to announce that our Moving and Handling People conference, that's been going over 25 years now, is actually back in 2022, hopefully face-to-face for the first time in such a long time. It's going to be held in Windsor, and it will be a 2-day event. We're really looking forward to getting people booked on that, and the tickets are now available. If you head over to our website, you'll be able to do that. We also deliver training, and Trusted Assessor is one of our main accredited courses, but we do offer a range of things for professionals, such as the Home Adaptations course that we are talking about today. The money that's spent on the training, so when you pay for the training, the money actually goes back into the charity, which also helps us meet our aim to get to those 2 million people a year. So it's really appreciated when you do come along with us and book onto these sessions. And today, if you do book from the back of this webinar, you get 10% off any booking that you make before the end of March. So please do go along and have a look. So the course we're going to give you a snippet from today is actually the Home Adaptations for Professionals course. It's accredited at level 5 and it runs over 5 days and 5 modules. Today we're focusing on the access to the home, which is actually our module 1, doing a little bit back to front, I'm afraid. But without further ado, I am actually going to hand over to another Claire, Claire Miller, who's going to take over from here. Thanks, everyone. Oh, carry on, Claire. Thank you.
Hi, it's good to see you all. Just to introduce myself, I'm Claire Miller. I'm an occupational therapist and trainer, also a coach, mentor and supervisor in the field of equipment adaptations and housing for my company, Occupational Therapy and Training Limited. I also work as an occupational therapist within a children's disability team of the Staffordshire County Council, so that keeps me really busy. And within the rest of my time, I'm writing, delivering training and assessments, and in particular, working as a freelance trainer for the DLF, developing and supporting a trusted assessor suite of courses and courses for occupational therapists and professionals. So today we're going to give you a snapshot of some of the considerations around access. It really is a taster. The course that we deliver is highly interactive and a very practical course. So we can only give you a real small taster of that in this kind of webinar environment. But hopefully we'll just give you a little bit of practical background as starting point to what we can do on the course. Within the course, we also look at case studies, justification and reasoning, and applying that theory into practice, that legislation that underpins what we do, but with that true person-centred focus. Okay, so firstly, when we are considering access solutions, we've got to decide on what's going to meet the need. So it's not just as simple as getting out of the house. I mean, we need to consider the person we're assessing, their abilities, limitations, their needs and the wishes of themselves and those around them. And, you know, as occupational therapists in the audience will reflect on the number of times when we get a referral in for, you know, a ramp for somebody and actually find that that's not what that person wants and it's far, far from what they actually need. So we're looking at that. How are we going to establish the needs of the person? And although we don't leave the house as often as perhaps we used to these days, we'd also, you know, if you think about the last time you left the house, you had to plan it, thought about it, made sure you've got your keys and all those kinds of things, make sure you've got your mask, you know, all these things we have to remember now when we leave the home. And that in itself can be quite a challenge for a person with disabilities or with any other sort of challenges in life. So when we think about leaving the home, there's a lot to consider. So we start with preparation, getting all that stuff ready. I've just said, you know, I always say tickets, money, passport, isn't it? When you go on holiday, you're gathering your keys, your money, your credit card, change of clothing. You think about the people we support, they might need continence products, food, drink, nutrition, medication, mobile phone, other things going on. So there's a lot going on. And if you think about perhaps somebody with dementia, they may not have the cognitive skills to do all that preparation, but they might have a strong volition to leave the home. So these are the kinds of things that we need to take into account. We think about getting ready, don't we? And for some, thinking mental health, anxiety issues, the issue may not be the access point. The issue may be the psychological impact of actually getting ready to do that task, to perform that occupation. We next might think about moving through the door. And it's not just the front door, is it? We might be moving through other doors in the home to get through and out of the home. So for example, somebody in a wheelchair, they might be getting changed, ready for the day in the comfort of their ground floor bedroom. You know, they're using a bed in the dining room, for example. They want perhaps to get dressed and get into their wheelchair in privacy. But that's going to be an issue for them if they can't then go through the adjoining doors to get to the front door, never mind getting out. We think about securing the building, locks, keys, latches, etc. You know, can the door be closed behind, or are there issues that mean that person has to be dependent on someone else? Or does the person leave the door open because they feel that weighing up their risks and their benefits for them, that's the better solution? Think about navigating obstacles, those rugs, those beautiful flower arrangements that might be in the hallway that actually are much loved by that person, but actually could create hazards. The orientation of the door, the space to get around, the telephone table, all those kinds of things that could be in the way of the person or appear to be, or it might be those are the things that the person holds on to through that journey to leave the home. We think about carrying items, all those things, as I said, that we have to take with us for our journey. Bulging pockets make us physically wider. Having to carry a bag might affect our balance or might lead us to use the support of somebody else, where a better solution might mean you could be independent. We also think about mobility aids, needing different aids in the house than you might need outdoors, and transporting them. How are you going to lift that trolley that you need to get to the shops, to put your shopping in, over the threshold, down the step? It might be a bit of a struggle when it's empty, but actually on the way back with some tins of beans and whatever groceries you've got in there, it could prove to be impossible. So we need to be mindful of that, all of the tasks, the leaving and the coming back. And also quite mindful about transporting of aids. Often when people leave the home, they might walk to the door with a walking frame, for example, and their carer, when they're at the doorstep, takes that frame, pops it in the boot of the car. But that could leave them without anything to mobilise with to get to the car, and in turn leads them to need the support of somebody else. Whereas a good access solution could mean they can walk all the way through from their sitting room, through the house, out of the house and to the vehicle. So throughout the course, we'll think about solutions and we follow that OT process. Excuse me, clicked too fast. You see the arrow across the bottom there sweeps across from simple solutions to those relatively moderate size solutions. So we might start with something as simple as a grab rail and a half step. It may have been tried in the past and disregarded. It may be that that's not big enough, it's not in the right place. But we go back to those basics really and start with the simplest solution. Remember that phrase, the Royal College of OT phrase, small change, big impact. And engaging the client themselves in this process makes a massive difference. So we move through, we think about doors. As I already mentioned, it's not just the front door, it could be the doors that follow through the journey and allow the person to do the task of getting in and out of the house the way that they want to do it, with privacy and dignity. The next step on our journey might be looking at ramps. And there's a whole wealth of designs and styles of ramps, from temporary, portable, modular, and permanent solutions. And within each of those categories, there are many, many different designs. And you know that we're not going to cover everything on the course, but we'll talk about the key concepts, the impact of the solutions that we choose on the individual that's going to use them. And we really feed that into clinical justification. There's a reason why we're going to choose one thing over another. And the heart of that is the individual that we're assessing and their occupation and their occupational performance. I love the image that we've got on this slide of the ramp, because it doesn't really look like a ramp, but it's got all the features. It's got a door that's been adjusted, a low sill threshold. It's got a level platform in front of the door. It's got a gentle slope. It's got slight upstands on the sides. It doesn't need rails because it doesn't have to have them, because it's such a small slope that it doesn't need rails to comply with building regulations. You'll also may notice, although I know it's small on the screen, there's some drainage solution in there as well. And this allows that user to get onto the drive to get in and out of their accessible vehicle. And it just looks like it's been there forever. So next on our little slide here, we've got external stair lifts. So stair lifts are covered in quite detail on the module on different levels in the home. But there are a few additional factors to consider, and lots of people do ask about external stair lifts, and we'll come to that a little bit later. Next on our list here, we've got step lifts. As you may be aware, these require some construction work, preparation work, and this one replaces the steps at the door, and it actually might be that we're going at greater depth, and there has to be structures around and retaining walls in order to take a person up over considerable levels within their property. So there's a whole range of solutions, and that's a different that are used differently in different settings. And we'll cover these within the course in far more detail and a little bit more as we move on. So, as I've said, we're focused on the needs of the person. So one of the things we need to do when we're looking at the person is to measure them. And going really into basics here, we're going to measure the width of the person. So we're looking at the widest point. As you know, I always use my hands, and anybody who knows me knows I'm all about hands and movement. But if somebody's sitting in their wheelchair and their elbows are out, perhaps they've got fixed joints of the shoulders or the elbows, or perhaps their tummy is quite full, so it leads them to sitting with their arms out, that's going to increase the width of that person. It's quite pertinent when they're passing through a doorway. So we're going to ask that person measure that person when they're sitting comfortably. We don't want them to be strained and scrunched up and getting through the smallest space, because if they gain more weight or become stiffer or their cognition fails them, they actually may not fit through that door in the future. So we always want to measure people in a comfortable position. We think about toes and shoes. How long are they physically? And this applies not only to wheelchairs, as you can see in the image, but also when the person is walking with mobility aids. I always smile when some of the gentlemen on the course have arrived with their smart shoes and shirts and ties and got their nice pointed shoes, and what a difference that makes to the footprint of that person, depending on whether they're wearing slippers or boots, winter or summer shoes. The whole footprint of an individual can change considerably. We also want to think about the turning circle, and we square off that turning circle to create a good space for somebody to either pass through a door or step onto a platform, for example, for a ramp. When we think about the turning circle, we really are genuinely thinking about the person. It would be really easy to go to the manual of the wheelchair and say that it needs 1500 turning circle or 1100 turning circle. But that tells us what that equipment can achieve. So it doesn't tell us about the performance of the individual with that equipment. And then when you bring a carer into the equation, how that might change as well. We also want to consider the reach of the person. So this is essential for them reaching, the chain on the door, the lock on the door, turning the keys, etc. Can they reach? How much space do they need to reach? Good example of an issue that can arise is we've put in a half step for somebody. It's big enough for them to step onto, but once they've stepped down, they can't reach back into the house to pull that door shut and close the door. So here we can see an example. We've got Claire in the wheelchair, and she's a little bit sort of slouched in her seating. So her feet are far forward, her elbows are out. So we need to consider that. Is she sitting comfortably? Is she happy in the chair? We'd also consider about self-propelling as well. So, we're trying to capture every single mobility aid known to man in this little tiny presentation. But if somebody is self-propelling, their technique for self-propulsion is going to change how wide they are at the widest point. So we're always going to measure up to that widest point. Excuse me. And also their technique with the assistive equipment they use. Being mindful again, people often will push their wheeled mobility aids far, far out of their reach so that they can negotiate a challenging environment. We want to encourage people to keep those walking aids with them, so that if they want to push them out of the way, they still can do, but actually they're able to walk with that mobility aid throughout the task that they're completing. Think also about involuntary movements. We're touching on really fairly straightforward cases in most of this little presentation, but we know that we are supporting children and adults with some, vastly complicated neurology and behaviours. So we want to think about the movements of individuals. How do they move through the doorway? How does the journey between light and dark impact on them? Might they trap their fingers? Might we actually need to look at significantly wider doorways so that that person can pass through unchallenged? And sadly, last on the list, but really should be far higher on the list, are our carers. We want to make sure that we're meeting the needs of our carers. So we'll come to it in another slide, but we think about the posture of our carers. Many of our carers in the majority of the adaptations that are completed are older themselves and actually may benefit from the improvements that are made for the person that we're supporting. We want to be thinking about their posture when they're pushing a wheelchair and whether actually some of the carer tasks that they're completing are necessary, are they essential? Could we be showing them ways as a carer that they could perform their caring tasks more safely for them and in turn promote more independence for the person that they're caring for, and then give choice and control to the person that we're adapting the home of. So, excuse me. So what we're going to consider is things like the carer's posture and their gait. We're not going to be enabling them to walk in a different way. They may walk that way all of their lives. If you consider the weight of the load that they're pushing, and this is a moving and handling task, this could be impacting on them. So a small person pushing somebody who's heavier than them in a wheelchair can be quite a challenge. It could cause them to stoop, could cause them to be straining. We also don't want them to be lifting or twisting with the wheelchair too much as well. And this same principle applies when somebody is standing beside someone and assisting them to walk. So we think about the client's position, as I've said. Are they slouched in the chair? Are they using the correct equipment? If somebody has a walking frame that's too low, they themselves might be stooped and need support of others. If their walking frame is too high, it might cause them to tilt back and become unsteady when stepping up and down steps. We want to make sure the wheelchair is the right fit for the person, for their clothes and their capabilities, and supports the carer as well. And we think about the seasons. As I said before, if we're assessing somebody in the summer wearing lightweight clothing and ballet slippers on their feet, it might be very different to assessing somebody in winter clothing and big chunky boots. So we're just going to show a little video here. This is the training room, and what you can see here is I'm laying out my tape measures on the floor. This is a 1200 by 1200 space, so common in the building regs world, and I'm turning that wheelchair around. It's empty. I'm moving it safely and freely, and you can see it doesn't fit in that space. So I'm just going to extend it out to 1500 by 1500. So as I walk through and turn, this is a little bit more accommodating, but still, if there was a person in that chair, their feet would be over that line. You might also notice the wiggle of the wheels as we push forward. So here we have a carer assisting, and they're turning and moving in a comfortable way, and they too don't achieve that turn within 1500 by 1500 space. And here we can see Claire in the chair and being turned, and again, her feet overhang. Now, if this was an enclosed platform and had upstands around it, we'd be catching Claire's toes at certain points. But we also need to make sure the carer has space behind. There's room for feet, there's room for elbows. So we take this into account as well when we're thinking about the door width. Here we can see Claire in a more comfortably fitting wheelchair. She's sitting far better. She's actually narrower and shorter, but her carer has more of a challenge to move this design of wheelchair. And actually the footprint for this needs to be significantly larger, actually to deal with the carer support needs. Okay, so moving on, thinking back to that person, we want to be thinking about the door for them, opening the door and closing the door. That previous little video was thinking about moving around, but didn't actually take into account the swing of the door. What we want to happen on the platform of a ramp is for the person or persons using the equipment to be able to stand still or sit safely without rolling away from the door, and to close that door behind them. We want them to be able to lock the door. And we also want to consider independence versus support. So often we hear, it's okay, my husband will help, my wife will help, my daughter, my son, whoever. But actually, what would happen if they weren't there, if they couldn't do it? And actually, we might want to open the world up for Shirley to go out with Eileen. Neither Shirley nor Eileen can manage the door, so then they'd have to get somebody else in to do it. So it's really important that we consider opening up the options for independence as well as safety. And we can see from this image, this is a great door. She's got a spy hole. She's got a security chain, but she can't reach it. And actually the 5-point lever may actually be a challenge to open as well. And the door opens towards her, which is getting in her way. So we just popped in a little slide here, just thinking about virtual assessments as well. So we talked previously about how you might measure, laying out tape measures, etc. And we just wanted to give a little bit of thought to virtual assessments. Obviously, in the world that we're living in currently, virtual assessments are so important. But actually these can contribute positively to any assessments that we do. We know that the involvement of both service users, as I'll call them, or clients or citizens, and their carers is so empowering. That when things go wrong and people have been involved in the assessment process, in general, they have a greater understanding. And it's about working together, because at the end of the day, we want to meet their needs and we want to support what they're doing. It's all about them. So when we're doing a virtual assessment, we might prepare ahead of time, gathering in as much information as possible, the stories from the person themselves and the carers, and gather information from other sources as well. So you might go on Rightmove. I'm a big fan of going on Google. Google Maps tells you where it is. Google Earth gives a satellite view. You can see the terrain around the property, and you can go to Street View and see not just what the property looks like, but also the slope of the drive and the environment around. How's that person going to access the wider community? We can confirm some of our thoughts through a telephone conversation, through a video call. We can support families to take remote measurements. So they too could lay out the tape measures. We could give them crib sheets and prompts and guides to help them to achieve that. But what we need is something that's proportionate and that's necessary. And when we're assessing, we want to just focus on what's necessary. So driving by with their consent, speaking through a window, taking measurements of an open area might be possible in these restricted times, and actually could support somebody in the future. So, excuse me, when thinking a little bit more about those remote measurements, you know, as you saw, we laid down tape measures there. You may notice as well that we purposely chose the bit of the room that we used because there was a change in texture and a change in colour. So I do encourage people when they're measuring in the home, and I do this myself as well, is to focus on somewhere where there is a change in texture. So a threshold between the hall and the lounge, for example. When you're looking at that turning circle, you might lay out tape measures or create a space in the room to move within. This is a starting point. It's almost working backwards. What you're trying to see is, will the person fit into the measurement that I think might be okay? It is a good starting point, particularly at the moment where we are restricted in entering people's homes and taking these measurements. It's probably one of the most challenging parts of occupational therapy assessments on the home and environmental assessments during this COVID period, but it's a factor at any time. So we also might ask them to video or photograph, and we might do this ourselves, of course, with consent. And through this, we can see how safely the carer is moving and handling the wheelchair. Are they picking it up and bumping it around? Are they forcing it around on the carpet? It can give us a lot of information around how everybody is managing and how we might improve things further in the future. And I always ask people to repeat, just to be sure, different times of the day, do it a few different times, just to be sure that actually it's going to work that way and that's the right amount of space. And when you're passing through the doorway, a big bonus with that is it gives some indication of how wide you want all of the doorways to be in the home in relation to access. So we're thinking about ramps. Let's think about the solutions now. We've got a few different images on here. So you've got some portable channel ramps there. There's a, you might call a handy ramp. Forgive me, there's so many names and different ranges, as I've said, and you'll have seen lots of webinars about them, I'm sure, too. At the top there, we have what I describe as a very traditional concrete ramp solution that has all of the features that we might expect. And at the bottom, we have a modular ramp. So when we're considering what we're going to choose, and this is just a little snapshot, we're going to think about the skills and the abilities of those who are going to use the equipment. What are they using that equipment for? Can they lift it and lower it and set it down? I've talked quite a bit about the demands on carers when they're pushing a person and assisting them in a wheelchair. If you're going to add to that moving and setting up and storing temporary ramps that have to be picked up and set down each time, that's an added challenge to somebody who's already got this 24-hour role potentially. So that's something to consider. Going back to that top concrete solution, this is a minimal specification ramp. So it has a door opening outwards. It has a platform which is around 1 metre square, which is very small. It has upstands. It has a really good shallow gradient, and it has rails and guardrails. So the rails are continuous all the way along, which is fantastic. It's just what we want. Ticks all those boxes, just. But take a closer look. When that door opens onto the platform of the ramp, the door is in the way of the individual using it. So actually, when we think about these kind of solutions, it's so important to think about all of the factors. The solution at the bottom is a modular solution. And in this case, there are a pair of doors that are opening and there's a low threshold. So this creates level access in and out. It's a solution that could be picked up and tucked away and with little adjustment used at another appropriate access point for another service user or citizen in another property. The benefit of the double doors is that there's more space on the platform area to come out and turn around. The downside of the double doors is they often need securing by somebody else with latches on them after the person's left. But you can see it's really simple. And all of these solutions really are for single step access. When we think just briefly about building regulations, I kind of have alluded to little bits and bobs in there, particularly when I described the ramp. So we want adaptations to meet the building regulations and standards for a quality build. And the reason for this is because we want them to be built to last. Those guidelines, the document M of building regulations, give us very, very clear basics to work to. They've been well reasoned, well studied. There is a reason why they exist, and it's based on the experiences of the built environment for disabled people. However, they're a minimum requirement, and we need to not lose sight as occupational therapists and adaptations assessors of the person's needs. If they need more room, then we need to provide more room or find a way. And it may be that if they need more room and there isn't the space for that, then the solution that we're looking at isn't an appropriate solution. So it's about gathering in all the information and using the building regulations as a background, as a context for what we do. And we will cover that and we'll discuss that a little bit further in the course. And I have no doubt whatsoever that there'll be questions in the chat today that relate to this. And I know that an awful lot of occupational therapists and adaptations teams work to very, very prescriptive specifications, which have been drawn from building regulations. But we need to marry that up with the individual needs of the person. So examples, measurements and shapes and sizes, you'll often see referred to platforms as being, as I mentioned before, 1200 by 1200, 1200 by 1500, 1500 by 1500. And these measurements are referenced from Part M of the building regulations. The example we have here is a modular ramp. And there's a reason why modular ramps can be put into place so quickly and so effectively. I mean, my sort of championed turnaround was 24 hours for a little boy in a palliative care setting. And the reason they could do it so quick is the sections of the ramp are modular and they are based on these designs and these dimensions. So it's easier to piece together the modular parts because they are based on set dimensions. However, we may need it to be bigger, or we might want it to be smaller, but we go for these dimensions so that they can be used comfortably and safely. When we think then about the width of the ramp, so these are kind of those environmental and solution-based issues. Guidance would suggest between 1 metre and 1200 wide. And the reason for this is to ensure that the person has space to walk up and walk down, to use a variety of mobility aids. They're able to use the rail if they need and want to. But we also need to consider the space that perhaps a carer might need to pass them by. So an example is a carer stands beside somebody to give them confidence when walking. They might want to then pass them by to open the car door at the end of the ramp. Another example where you might need to go significantly wider might be, say, a child who has a respiratory condition and they have tracheotomy in place, and they're wanting to go into the community. And in those situations, medical emergencies could occur at any time. So you want to be able to pass by that child comfortably without any panic, and safely for carers who often health, social care, CHC funded carers as well as family, to be able to pass by and to come round to that child and assist them in the safest way possible. So these are minimums. Again, you might need to go wider. We also consider rails. So the rails at the side usually are between 900 and a metre, and that's to reduce the risk of toppling over the top. We add guide rails in there. This isn't to spoil the fun of the kids rolling over the rails like perhaps you might recall in your childhood, but it's actually to prevent any entrapment in between the top of the rail and the upstands at the bottom of the ramp. Wheelchairs these days, powered wheelchairs, are so powerful. It is possible that they could drive up and out and through those and catch the person at their head and their throat. And we obviously want to avoid that at all costs. You'll also see on this slide that there's some steps and a gate. And where there are steps and a gate present, that gate will be heavily sprung and will open towards the rails. So if a person in a wheelchair or comes by, if they lean onto that, they're not going to fall through and down those steps. But we also need to consider that if there's another user in the house who needs to use the steps because they can't manage the length of the ramp, can they manage the weight of the hinged gate? And it's possible these days to look at grants for more than one person, and part incorporates the ramp for one person and part of the funding incorporates the steps for the other person. So we're thinking in the wider context of the home. And we think about gradients. I'm not going to do any maths today, but we'll probably do some maths and working out on the day of the course. It's always a bit of a challenge, and 1 in 12 is often the go-to measurement because it's so easy to calculate when we think about feet and inches. But guidance supports different gradients, and these are minimum gradients, and these fit for different people in different circumstances. So 1 in 15 to 1 in 20 is quite a universal, both in domestic and outdoor settings for ambulant users. And what we mean by ambulant is anyone who's walking. So that includes the carer who's pushing the chair. So an attendant operated wheelchair, we'd look at a gentle slope of 1 in 15, but we could increase that significantly to support the needs of that person because they're pushing a heavy weight. We consider 1 in 12 as reasonable minimum for a self-propelling wheelchair user. But what we have to consider here is there's a wide range of self-propelling wheelchair users out there in the community, many of whom bump up and down curbs and steps like you wouldn't believe and have no need whatsoever for a ramp. They're strong, they're powerful. And then other wheelchair users are in heavy duty wheelchairs. So, an elderly person in an indoor self-propelling wheelchair may struggle significantly in 1 in 12, whereas a fitter person in a sporty wheelchair self-propelling might be able to do far steeper than 1 in 12. So it's all about the needs of the person and their skills. For portable ramps, these are for wheelchair use only, or they're designed for wheelchair use only. These are removable, moved in and out of place. So there's always a risk of slipping and movement. So we need to be very careful about that. The gradients for those are suggested at 1 in 8 to 1 in 12. And these should be used with attendant support and descending backwards to reduce the risk of, if there is movement, the person tipping out. But we also know that some of the ramp wedges that are used at internal thresholds are far steeper than this. And actually what we need to be careful of is that when you're going up and over, that you don't ground the wheelchair. And that can be the biggest challenge with portable ramps and choosing the right gradient. So we'll think about some other solutions here. Let's just pop the image up for you. This solution's a flexi step. It's something I always like to share with people because it's a little known product. So I think there's limited distribution in the UK, but these are in place in a few public places. I think there's a big theatre in Liverpool that has all of their steps, have these steps in place, and you wouldn't know it. So they've created a fully wheelchair accessible environment. So these are usually a small set of stairs They look like stairs, and the relationship of the steps is very much like traditional steps and stairs. These actually lower down into a very small platform lift, so the footprint is really small. So these work really well in a domestic setting where space is limited and where a traditional step lift might be too big or too disruptive to install. These are fantastic for variable conditions, for conditions where there may be deterioration and a wish and a desire to continue climbing steps for as long as possible. Great for multiple users. Somebody has no issues, somebody uses a wheelchair, their needs are both met. And fantastic for development. So it could be the child who's developing through their stages around walking and stepping. They don't have any disability needs, but they might lose that opportunity to climb steps and stairs if they were removed. Also skill acquisition. Again, there might be others in the home who are learning to build confidence on steps and stairs. So we don't want to remove them from that environment. But for me, the real benefit of this is that it's so compact, but equally it's quite expensive. And I'll give you just a quick case study of where I used this. It was a gentleman whose dwelling was on one level and then steps up to the kitchen and access beyond. It was a listed building, so we couldn't do anything with the front. But if we got him through the kitchen and to the back, he could get out on level surface. There was very little room in the hallway, and a traditional step lift just wouldn't fit. And he actually had 3 steps, so it was slightly smaller than this, but the footprint was absolutely perfect for his wheelchair. He had wildly variable rheumatoid arthritis and had treatment. And he could go from walking with a stick and skipping around, really, to needing a wheelchair in the space of 3 months. So this solution met all of his needs. But also his wife didn't want to lose out on steps. There were children in the household who were crawling and developing, so they didn't want to lose those opportunities too. So for them, this was the ideal solution. So we also have examples like platform lifts as solutions. We have to think about how accessible they are. Often they have to be placed somewhere else, and these examples that we show here is a few different examples of designs and locations as well. We have to consider, are they usable? Some people can be quite frightened of this technology. They look big and they want to be sure that they're going to be happy with the solution and use it, and it's not actually going to be one of them things that they use very occasionally with help. We want to know that they're safe and the person feels safe and protected from vandalism and theft, which can unfortunately be an issue. We want to know that when it needs to be used, it can be used. And they may be in the way of or become part of access for others, which could be a challenge, for example, others in the home with learning difficulties, etc. And some structures need planning permission, so where there needs to be retaining walls, etc. And under Disabled Facilities Grant, it could use up a considerable amount of the grant and need to then seek discretionary and additional funding. So a lot to think about, and that's a whistle stop. We also think about creative designs. As I mentioned earlier with that image at the bottom, it doesn't have to be ugly. It doesn't have to really look like a ramp. And this example, the platform and the ramp slope were the same width. It looks so neat and tidy. The example at the top isn't a disabled adaptation at all. It's actually my friend's new built house, and they integrated a ramp and sloped pathway into the design of the property, and it links really well into the drive. If you've moved into a property or the environment is like this, you might get used to it and never need a traditional ramp, especially when it's coupled with low sill doors, etc. And as I mentioned earlier, we can think about outdoor stair lifts, think about vandalism, obstructions, fire hazards, etc. And you might need a fire safety report. Also think about limited space. Often where there's an external staircase and a little platform right by the door, there just isn't the space to use this, and it's not a viable solution. So we're thinking about things like the weather as well, and the integrity of the solution. I mean, they are designed to be used outdoors. This is not an indoor stair lift being used in an outdoor environment. But if you imagine hail, snow, rain, all the rest of it, by the time you've dealt with getting up and down and perhaps any carer assistance involved, that might not lead to a positive experience of leaving the home. So these words will be familiar to you guys working in the field of adaptations. All of the solutions need to be reasonable and practicable. And whilst that's not the key focus of occupational therapists usually, as a team we're working together to do the best that we can to support a successful outcome. So sometimes we're aware of the fact that this might not be deemed reasonable or practical. And the occupational therapist perspective is looking at the necessary element. And is this appropriate? Is it going to meet the needs? Is this the best thing? Looking at now, looking into the future, looking at those predictables as best we can. So what we're going to do now is we're going to hand back over to both Stuart and Claire in our green room and hopefully answer some of your questions. So I just want to thank you very much for listening, but don't go anywhere, because hopefully we'll give you some of the answers to your questions right now too. Thank you.
Hi, Claire. Thank you so much for that presentation. Very in-depth, lots of information and lots of questions in my hand. So I'm just going through a couple of them. So thank you so much. I did tell everyone we'll keep within time. So we got a bit of time left, which is great for questions. So we've had, Jennifer's asked around legislation pertinent to access to the garden. So Sally's just popped a bit of legislation in the chat box. And I know that is for England, and there is a Welsh Assembly circular from 2005 as well for Wales. But is there any specific legislation that you would recommend looking at to cite for access to the garden? But I'll give you some context. I have a wheelchair user that has access ramps down to their garden. However, there's only a small 2 metre by 2 metre cement landing. Therefore, no access actually to the garden. They want access to the garden for over the summer. So is there specific legislation that you would cite while applying for funding?
Do you want me to take that one?
Yes, please.
Obviously, there's that addition within the DFG guidance around access to the garden. I think the challenge is always going to be how do we determine what is a reasonable amount of space? I think going back to some of the points I raised in the presentation, if the space that's available to them is only the same size as the turning circle, then how are they actually, are they actually able to use the garden? It is quite a discussion point as to what access to the garden actually means. You might draw on elements of the name of the legislation is escaping me now. Human rights, for example, the right to family life. And an example of that might be where a parent is supporting a child and the parent has a disability. Certainly access to the garden for play is not stipulated clearly within the guidelines. However, it's part of child development. So you may be drawing on other forms of legislation in order to support the individual, such as the element of well-being within the Care Act, the ability to thrive, develop and grow for a child in the Children Act. And, as I say, Human Rights Act can be drawn upon. This is about that clinical reasoning and justification. So I hope that in some way answers that question.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. If obviously Jennifer has any further questions, she can drop me an email and we can send her some further information. You'll see the slide number 1, Claire. Either Claire can answer this question, but we've got the ramp and we've got a grab rail on the left-hand side. And Carla's asked, should the grab rail actually be in that position? Or should it be to the right next to the window? Now, it could be that it was there prior to the access ramp was installed, but I wondered if Claire from DLF's also nodding, but if you could answer that for Carla, that would be great.
To be honest with you, I think it was there before the ramp was fitted, but it's not my picture. I stole it from somebody else. So I will find out the exact answer to you. But I guess there is probably a likelihood that they've put it in that side. It could be to assist coming out of the property instead of going in, or that because there's a window in the way. I can't quite see it on the screen. But yeah, I think it probably was there before the ramp.
I think it's a good point to raise as well, because it does highlight the fact that removal of previous adaptations is not always covered in our schemes. And what we can do is, when we're making a recommendation, is if using that rail in that position could prove to be a hazard for the user, now there's a ramp in place, we might add in removal of the rail and making good as part of our specification.
I completely agree. Many a time I've attended a property and you'll see grab rails still in bad positions, or you'll see a rusty rail and somebody's gone and fitted the new rail next to it. But the problem is they've said, oh, I've only been told to install the new rail. So I think, yes, we don't always go out and evaluate, but a quick telephone call just to say, is everything okay? What happened to the old rail? Or even, like you said, for safety, because the disabled facilities grant, or any of the grants or funding really, would allow for you to remove a hazardous rail or a hazardous bit of kit. And I'll hold my hand up. Sometimes I've gone back out to review a client and say, oh, we didn't get that removed, did we? But it's important to consider that. So I think it's a very good question and a very good point. So thank you so much. I like this question because it's always when I get asked, if a temporary ramp is supplied, where does the fire and emergency evacuation factors get considered if the person is unable to put the temporary ramp in place? So I suppose it's not the big green one, it's more of a temporary ramp, isn't it? And if somebody puts it in to help the person, like a carer, what then happens for fire and evacuation?
Yeah, it's a really good point, and it's part of assessing the individual's needs. It's the overall bigger picture, and fire safety comes into that as well. It is really important. I think what's really important to consider is what happens in an emergency. And let's just set the ramp aside for a moment and consider approaching the local fire and rescue service to complete a home safety and evacuation plan with that person, because it may well be that if they can't get to the door, you know, something happens at a certain time of the day, if they can't get to the door, how will they get out? Never mind putting the ramp down. How will people get into them? How would the fire service support them? So I would say this is a bigger picture issue, without wanting to inflate the concern about those risks. But yeah, that could be your clinical justification for supporting a long-term and more permanent solution. You know, how will that person get out? I've known somebody in a situation, they had ramp, they needed assistance to get in and out of the property, but in an emergency as a double amputee, if there was a fire, he would lower himself to the floor and shuffle out and go out of the house on his bottom. So for him, he had that need for a ramp. Even though he only usually went out with carers, we provided a solution that was fully accessible in all circumstances, and that would allow him to go out on his bottom if there was an emergency or a reason that he wanted to go out without his prosthesis in place or without his wheelchair.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. It's quite interesting because the fire brigade will come out and do an audit assessment. And I know with clients we've had in the past, we've had a couple of clients in South Wales, and one was on TV. I think there was a programme about one individual, not a client of mine, but in South Wales, in excess of 40 stone. So the fire brigade did have an emergency procedure in place. Secondary to that as well, we've had some good discussions with people like the water board and the gas and electricity providers. And they also, if you're going to be putting a major adaptation in on a ramp, they suggest making sure that that client is also on their register. So if there's a power cut or a problem, or there's flooding or a flood risk, the water board would like to know, because they can make sure they send the fire brigade, the police or whoever to them straight away to make sure they're out of the property safely. So yeah, it's a very good question. And it's weird because it's not what we're trained to do as occupational therapists. We don't go to university and get taught about fire regulations and sprinkler systems and stay put policies. But when you're looking at adaptations, obviously we need to consider all these things, and not be afraid to pick up the phone and ask the fire brigade. So brilliant. Thank you so much. A couple more questions. What is the steepest gradient for a temporary ramp?
So, well, the slide showed that it was 1 in 8 to 1 in 12 is recommended, but you really have to speak to each individual provider. The fact that we recommend you don't use something below 1 in 8 doesn't mean that you couldn't put a ramp on a doorway that's steeper than 1 in 8. As I said earlier, the risk then is that you could ground the wheelchair. As the front wheels are on the ramp going down, you may not be able to get the back wheels on, and that in turn may move the ramp, or the person's toes could hit the floor before the back wheels are on the ramp. And the person at the back, the carer assisting, will not see that. Likewise, if they're going backwards, they then can't see what's going on behind. So there's a whole range of reasons why we recommend, but actually in reality, you could put a wedge of wood at a doorway that's like this. And Claire and I have shared many pictures when we developed the courses of very strange and interesting and steep ramp solutions. But this is about looking at what's safe for an individual person to use and what the manufacturers recommend. So perhaps not the clearest of answers I can give you, but there are so many products around, and you know, at the end of the day, somebody can lean a plank of wood against a step and use it as a ramp, and that would be their choice.
Great, thank you very much. Again, the reality of the situation is you might not be able to put the appropriate ramp in. And I remember going to a Michael Anderson lecture quite a while back, and I think at the DLF conference 2 years ago, Claire, I think somebody also asked about provision, and the question was along the lines of, what happens if you don't provide? So I think sometimes you've got to work out that it might be better to put something steeper in with a risk assessment than not put something in at all. But again, that's an individual decision, and often a team discussion with your team manager and your colleagues, because obviously we have to make sure that we're all on the same page. I think that's quite important. Following on from that, we've got one around scooters. So I have a client with a small mobility scooter, will be stored outside on the platform, will need to use the ramp to exit the garden for community access. Is this okay? So it's about scooters and using scooters on ramps, and also where to store the scooter, and also accessing the garden for community access. So really just about mobility scooters in general is their key points and considerations.
All sorts to consider in there. Think about the weight limit of the solution, you know, the design of the solution. Is it robust enough to take the weight of the equipment? And obviously we don't know context of the person, and it may be, if it's a heavier person on a solid and robust scooter, then you want to make sure that whatever equipment is used meets the weight limit, and that's a discussion with the manufacturer. I think key for me is, can the situation be made safe? So can you charge the scooter up safely at that point? Is it a fire hazard? Have a chat with the fire service. Is the scooter being parked on the platform getting in the way of that person and others safely accessing and egressing the house, the garden, etc.? And if it is, then a bigger platform may be required. But the bigger platform might then expose the mobility equipment to rain. So it's all of those different factors. For me, I'm a huge advocate of supporting the individual to use the mobility equipment that's the most appropriate solution for them, and also unburdening the NHS waiting list for wheelchairs by not referring everybody who uses a scooter as a chosen mobility aid for a wheelchair assessment. If that's their chosen form of mobility, then maybe that's what we need to support. It might be that what they need is a scooter store at the base of the ramp or out of the way, but we could discuss to the ends of the earth on that, but actually there may not be room for that. So it's very much on an individual basis, but hopefully that's given some ideas that answers that question.
Brilliant, thank you. We are running short of time. In fact, I've slightly gone over. So a couple of the other questions we'll send across, and we'll send them out to everybody anyway. Just a quick follow-on from scooters. And again, I'll answer this probably quite quickly, in my opinion, but I'll send it to both Claires for their opinion as well. Are OTs providing ramps or assessments for clients who have purchased their own scooters or wheelchairs and may not have attendance allowance or DLA PIP? My experience is no, but wanted to know from others. So I'm going to answer the question briefly from my opinion as a clinician. Are OTs providing ramps or assessments? It's illegal to not provide an assessment. Everybody is entitled to an assessment regardless of the request. And I think we've got to remember that the request may be for a ramp, but it's not an occupational therapy assessment. It's an assessment of need, which means social services has a legal obligation to provide the assessment. So just in case people feel, or they've asked for something I can't provide, for example, a hard standing, forget about what they've asked for. explain to the client that it's an assessment of need, and obviously on the DLF course they'll explain all that to you. But I think it's important to realise it's not an occupational therapy assessment, and it's not an assessment for a ramp. It's an assessment of need, and the outcome may be a ramp. So just something that the Royal College of OT is very specific on, and I think is really important. Do not fetter your discretion. Do the assessment. If the client's saying, I only want you out for the ramp, then write to them, explain that you're not there for that purpose, and then it's up to them if they have you in their house, because again, they may no longer consent. And if the client says no, then don't do the assessment. I think that's quite important. Are they providing ramps? Both players will know the answer to this as well. It's a postcode lottery. I've worked in several local authorities across the UK. Some do, some don't. Some housing associations do, some housing associations don't. I think what you can do is, if you're having trouble with your local authority, your housing association, is seek evidence. Go onto LinkedIn, make contact with other people, use Facebook, use Twitter, go on the DFG Champions website on Facebook, ask the questions, ask what's happening in other authorities, and ask if you can get support off other occupational therapists. Reach out to Claire Miller and Claire from DLF. Just ask the questions, reach out to us as well. We can give you advice on places we know do provide scooter stores. We can give you advice on places that will provide ramps. And I do also echo what Claire said. We've got to get away from referring everyone back to the NHS for an assessment of need for a scooter. If a client has used their DLA or their PIP to buy one, it's a bit easier because they've already had a benefit to pay for the scooter. So yes, it should be considered. But that doesn't mean if Mrs. Jones has gone and bought it herself that we should straight away not support Mrs. Jones. So again, just short of time, but I wanted to pop that in. Specific height for guardrails, usually anything about over 150 mil, 15 centimetres, they say, put an upstand in. But again, we can send some further information across for that. And that's about it question-wise. But sorry, it was a whistle-stop tour at the end. But I am conscious this is people's lunch break, and people need to go back and do their bits and pieces. So I just want to say thank you very much from me. Claire keeps reminding me that I have to tell people, if you quote this webinar or any of the 4 in the series, you do get a discount. I believe it's 10% off the course. But Claire can confirm all that with you. But yes, if you say I was there, then you'll get a discount for whether you're paying privately or as part of your team. There's some questions around provision of flexi steps, who supplies equipment, that type of thing. If we haven't answered your question, we will drop that in the email where we send everything across. So your certificate should arrive within about 48 hours. We will have copies of the video within 7 to 10 days. So if you don't receive that link for the video, which will be to our YouTube channel at Promoting Independence, please drop me an email and I'll come back to you. So I'm just going to pass you all back to the Claires in case there's any further comments from them. But I would just like to once again reiterate, thank you so much to Claire Miller for today doing this presentation. A lot of information, a lot of food for thought. And again, thanks to DLF for working with us at Promoting Independence to bring this presentation to everybody. It's extremely helpful to everybody who not necessarily can get out and see people or haven't been able to for months. So it's really good to consider that this can be done virtually as well as when we do get to go out again. So from me, thank you very much, and over to the Claires.
Yeah, just to say thank you, Stuart, for letting us come along and deliver it. And we're looking forward to the next one. And a big thank you to Claire for your help with the delivery of the presentation. And we look forward to seeing you next time.
Likewise, thanks for attending. Thanks for listening, and look forward to seeing you on the courses in due course.
Take care, everyone. Take care, everyone. Bye.